There are some tales of military endeavour that are quite stirring, quite affecting, quite poignant perhaps. These might be tales of tremendous self-sacrifice or defiance against overwhelming odds. And I'm going to tell you one such in this video, which has been sponsored by Raycon, but more of that later. Now, I must first set the scene. It's the North African desert in 1943. The war in the desert has gone back and forth a number of times. Hostilities kicked off in June of 1940. Now, before the war, the Italians, fascists, had been belligerent aggressors and had conquered, for example, Abyssinia by sheer force of arms, and it seems just out of sheer greed. And when they declared war on Britain and France in 1940, then Britain had to react. Declaring war on France turned out to be a completely safe thing to do, but declaring war on Britain, it turned out, wasn't. So the British realised that they had a lot of interests in the area. They had substantial military forces in Egypt, and they now had a new enemy, the Italians in North Africa, and this became the Second Front. But they were somewhat underprepared to take on a large campaign in the area, but they did plan a 5-day raid against the Italians called Operation Compass. And the 5-day raid became 6 days, 7 days. It just sort of carried on because they were doing so well. It just seemed the thing to carry on. And after a while, they ended up defeating the Italian 10th Army. Oops. Anyway, the Germans thought, well, we've now won World War II, essentially. We've done the main thing that Germany tries to do, that is to say, conquer France. We've got we've got Czechoslovakia, we've got Hungary and Romania. They're generally on side. We've got Belgium and Denmark and the Netherlands, and we've got allies in Spain. And everything's going fine. We've won, essentially. But maybe we should, because it looks bad if we don't, maybe we should help our Axis allies out in North Africa. And so they sent over the force to become known as the Afrika Korps. And at first things went actually quite well for the Germans, and they pushed the British right the way back into Egypt, although the Commonwealth forces were able to hold on to Tobruk. But then the British regrouped, got resupplied, reshuffle of officers, new tactics. Okay, and they launched Operation Crusader, and they pushed the Germans far to the west again, liberating Tobruk. Hooray! And things looked pretty good. It looked as though the British had pretty much won. They'd finish off the Germans in due course, but the Germans were pretty cut off now and running out of supplies. Oh, and they had other priorities. So for example, Greece had been conquered by the Italians and Germans, and so liberating Greece now looked like a very good idea. So they took a lot of their best units and equipment and sent them over to liberate Greece. Which reminds me, actually, for about 2 weeks, this is years ago, I studied at the Greek National Film School in Athens. And one of the lecturers, talking to, there are about 20 British students there, she said that, as though possibly we didn't know, that Britain invaded Greece in World War II. And I do remember thinking that invaded was not the best choice of words. I mean, you liberated? Maybe it would have been better. I mean, I'm not saying it was all sweetness and light, but I did think that invaded was a poor choice of words. Anyway, I wasn't even going to talk about Tobruk. But then the Germans thought, so a lot of their best kit has gone over to Greece, has it? Oh, okay, it's pretty much out of range. A lot of their best troops as well. Oh, and we've got a load of new kit. I think this is a bit of a goer. And, well, would you believe it? They attacked again and pushed the Commonwealth forces way back to the east again. And this time did take Tobruk. Oh, I know, all that effort trying to hang on to it. Sorry, everyone, but they then did manage to lose Tobruk. But then the British regrouped again. Montgomery took over, and how important that actually was to the British victory, I think it often gets exaggerated. I think Montgomery was holding the Field Marshal's baton when the victory eventually happened, but I think a lot of the groundwork had already been laid by commanders before him, but he did get a lot of the credit for the victory. Anyway, so he fought the Second Battle of El Alamein, and then the Germans were pushed way to the west again. But they still weren't finished off. They still had substantial forces. Rommel was busy fighting the 8th Army to the southeast, and Kesselring ordered Operation Oxhead, Ochsenkopf, if you prefer it in German, to go ahead. Now, the records seem to show that Rommel was not in favour of this idea. He thought it was over-ambitious and risky. But anyway, Kesselring ordered it, and there were going to be two horns of the bull, the north and the south. And the north horn was commanded by one Colonel Rudolf Laing. And he was given a very substantial force. He had about 13,000 men under him and a lot of the absolute latest kit. He had some brand spanking new Panzer VIs. Yes, that's right, Tigers. Exactly how many did he have? It depends on which source you look at. 18 or 19, though, seems to be roughly how many he had. In total, he had something in the region of 77 Panzer tanks, and on top of that, a lot, couldn't tell you exactly how many, but a lot of other armoured vehicles, including lots of self-propelled guns, some of which I know were Italian Semoventes. And interestingly, he had American half-tracks that had been captured. Why I find that particularly interesting is that in my childhood I watched an awful lot of bad American war movies made in the 60s and 70s, and the German half-tracks were always played by American half-tracks, just painted grey and with crosses put on the side. There you go, German half-track. And you think, yeah, it's very obviously an American half-track. It looks nothing like a 251 Hanomag. But actually, the Germans did have some of those, though it's clear even from black and white photographs they were not painted grey. This was North Africa in 1943, and no, they didn't put crosses on lorries. That was a tank recognition symbol. But never mind. The Germans did actually have some M3 American half-tracks. And so he had a huge column of well-equipped, well-trained troops. He had the 21st Panzer Division with him. He had the 10th Panzer Division with him. He had the famous 501st with their Tigers. So, these were first-rate units with the latest stuff. And unusually for the Germans, it was almost all motorised. And with this huge column, he was going to head to take the town of Béja. And Béja was a key town, a key objective. If the Germans could take Béja, they could then, this would create a huge salient which would be completely untenable. And when that fell, the supply lines to the north and the ports for the British would become extremely difficult. Logistically, it would be a hammer blow to the Allied interests in North Africa. I should have mentioned, by the way, this is after Operation Torch. Which explains the presence of the American half-track. So when was it? November 1942, the Americans joined the war in the West, landing in Morocco in Operation Torch, which sort of meant that the clock was ticking for the Germans, because with the Americans involved, more and more munitions and men were arriving every week, and so the longer they left it, the less chance they would have of victory. So you could perhaps understand Kesselring's decision for this bold roll of the dice, but maybe he could make a lightning strike to the town of Béja and cut off the Allies from a lot of their supplies and ports, and maybe this could win the wars for the Axis. So a lot was at stake, and the force that he selected was, as I say, fast, motorized, and with the latest kit. So this force could move quickly and hit hard. So it was with some reasonable expectation that he could get to the town of Béja, but you would have to go through what's known as Hunt's Pass. Hunt's Pass was something like 20 miles long, and was the only viable tank run in the area to get from the town of Matur to Béja. And that apparently is why Rommel really didn't like the plan. He thought that was just too big a risk to take. But anyway, sometimes when things get desperate, you have to roll the dice, and that was the plan on the German side. Now, the defender in a situation like this has a big disadvantage. Even if he's got greater forces, they have to be spread wide and thin, because the defender doesn't know where the hammer is going to fall. Part of the defence for the British was the 172nd Field Regiment of Royal Artillery. This had, in the standard arrangement of the time, 3 batteries of 8 guns, and each of those was divided into 2 troops of 4 guns. These were 25-pounders. This was not, I feel I need to stress this was not an elite unit by any means. It was a hodgepodge unit like countless others in the British Army that had been put together, in this case from territorials, from coastal batteries, from conscripts. They hadn't had a huge amount of training, and they hadn't got off to a brilliantly good start either, because they as some accounts put it, went for a swim in the Mediterranean. That is to say, the ship they were arriving on was sunk by a torpedo and they lost all their equipment. Very few of them died, thank goodness. They were picked up in boats and they made it ashore, but they then had to be given new equipment. This was not a highly trained unit. This was not a unit that had gone into action ever. It had no experience. And it was not a unit that you would expect great things of. I shouldn't go too far. I'm not saying that it was a dregs unit or anything like that, but it was a very ordinary unit being attacked by pretty much the best that the Germans had to throw at them. So, the three batteries were not all in one place because the commander, Brigadier Graham, he didn't know where the hammer was going to fall, so he put his three batteries in three different places, hoping to cover the front as best he could. And in support of 155 battery, later, for reasons that will become obvious, known as the glorious 155 or the VC battery, they were defending a place called Sidi Nsir, which was just a tiny cluster of stone Arab hovels and, importantly, one railway station. It was the railway station that serviced the railway line that went along Hunt's Pass. And so that was where, though nobody knew it at that point, that was actually where the hammer blow was going to fall. Now, a lot of accounts, they want to sort of revel in the degree of mismatch between the two sides, and so some of the accounts actually completely ignore the fact that 155 battery wasn't totally alone. With it, there was, in the area, there was a battalion of 5th Hants, that is to say, the 5th Battalion of the Hampshire Regiment of Infantry. These were also not tested, not well-trained troops, but they were there, and they were the buffer at the front. They had a forward base at Sidi Nsir, and they were the first troops to encounter the oncoming enemy. February the 25th, 1943, all seemed pretty quiet. There was a conference of officers of 155 battery that spent 2 hours looking through binoculars, scrutinising everywhere they could think that the enemy might be, and they saw nothing. The Germans had kept this attack very well covered. But at night, the forward units of Hants encountered some of the enemy, and there was some stiff fighting and had to fall back. And a lot of what are called Verey lights. Verey was an American, actually, he got the pistol named after him. His name is actually V-E-R-Y, Verey, and yet the pistol is often V-E-R-E-Y, I suppose just because it doesn't look like the common English word very. But anyway, a Verey pistol essentially was a flare gun, and they were commonly used for launching coloured flares into the air. And the Germans were launching quite a lot of these, and so that was a bit disturbing. But of course, sometimes a large number of flares is just a big decoy. You don't know that it means anything, but it did. At 6:30 the following morning, on the 26th, the mortar bombs started to rain down. And in some accounts, the first mortar bombs are actually falling on 155 battery. My suspicion, and I'm doing a bit of reading between the lines here and looking at different accounts, is that the very first mortar bombs probably actually fell on the 5th Hants. But very soon they were falling on the guns of the forward battery, the forward troop, I should say, which was F Troop of 155 battery of the 172nd. Royal Artillery Field Regiment, and immediately you know things are going very wrong, because the standard German mortar of the time, the 81mm, had a range, a perfectly respectable range for a medium mortar, I should add, of 1,300 yards. That was actually pretty good. But if you are manning a 25-pounder, which is what the British Royal Artillery were using, which has a range, supercharged range of 13,400 yards, well, if the enemy is hitting you before you're hitting the enemy, you know, already things are going very wrong. The Germans have come forward very quickly in the night and have overrun the first position, and they took out an awful lot of the eyes of the gunners. There were observation posts out front. One Captain Lawrence, for instance, had put his command post in a very good spot for directing the fire. But it was a very bold move. You see, the more you can see, the more can see you. It was a bold decision, and it cost him his life. Lieutenant McGee was captured, and all the British forward radios were smashed and all the telephone lines were cut. So there were now no forward observers. There was no indirect fire to be called in on the enemy. The guns were effectively blind. And the first time they were engaging with the enemy proper, they were doing over what sometimes referred to as open sights. Normally a 25 pounder is angled something like that when it fires, to lob a shell high into the air at a target which is unseen. But they had to fire directly at the enemy, aiming their guns like an ordinary rifle. And this was something that artillerymen were not used to, not trained particularly much to do. And if you're opening a battle, having to fire over open sights, and you're being mortared, and you're an artilleryman, straight away you're thinking, wow, this is not how it's meant to go at all. We're supposed to, yeah. So the mortar bombs are raining down thick and fast and causing casualties. The Germans have clearly zeroed in their mortars pretty well and have observed targets. Now, this story of the unit that got destroyed was kept secret. It was Lord Milne who stood up in the Houses of Parliament some while later, who complained to Parliament. He was allowed to talk openly about things that were secret for the general public. This was before Parliament was televised. And he complained that there were some actions that had been kept secret that should not be kept secret. And this was one of them. This was an action that he thought that the British should be shouting from the rooftops, not sweeping under the carpet. It was, as you're going to learn, a crushing defeat for the British. And yet he thought that it demonstrated something stirring and wonderful, and that the British public should be let in on it. And 2 days later, after his complaint in Parliament, an official report was released for public consumption, and articles printed in the newspapers and in the magazines like the War Illustrated. I read the War Illustrated account. Always, when you read something like a War Illustrated account, you must remember this was written for public consumption at the time, so it's not completely reliable. But it does get a fair number of facts right. And yes, so he released it. But why did he stand up in Parliament to say this story should be told? Well, sorry, it's a little segue. I just thought of that extra thing. So they're being shelled, and they see up ahead a column of armoured vehicles, and at its head a tiger. It's fairly logical to put a heavily armoured thing right at the head of the column. And so there they were, these inexperienced gunners looking at a tiger coming at them that really wasn't very far away. And they had ever such a big gun on them, a very noisy engine. And they opened fire on open sights at the head of the column. And they knocked out 3 German tanks. And just about every account agrees that these were knocked out at a very convenient position, because there was a minefield, a British minefield that the gunners would have known about, and just as the road went through that minefield was where they knocked out the tanks, blocking that road, so any other vehicles having to pull off the road to go around would have to go into the minefield. None of the accounts, however, makes it clear whether this was luck or judgment. Did they deliberately hold fire and wait and only open fire when the tanks were there, hoping to block the road at precisely that point? I don't know. But anyway, they did block the point. And of course, this then held the Germans up for some while. But the Germans still had overwhelming numbers and were still determined to come forward. And that's what their orders were. Messerschmitts attacked out of the blue. Bf 109s, 8 of them, strafing the ground with 2 centimetre cannon and lots of machine guns, and dropping the odd bomb as well. These ground attacks were extremely effective, and they could attack with almost total impunity. The British just had a few Bren guns to shoot back, and amazingly did score at least 2 hits. There were 4, I believe, claimed and 2 confirmed Messerschmitts shot down with Bren guns. But the damage was horrendous. Loads of the gun crews were killed. Clearly the pilots had spotted where the guns were and strafed each one in turn again and again. The Bren guns really didn't keep anyone very safe. Yes, they did shoot a couple of them down, but it didn't stop the others from attacking. And the casualties mounted. And possibly even worse, the ammunition lorries parked behind the battery in the road down the hill behind them were set on fire. Those ammunition lorries didn't just have the 25-pounder shells and their separate charges of explosives. They also had a load of something called ammonal. I'm not entirely sure how to say it. It's a type of explosive. I'm not very familiar with it. It was used in some grenades and mines, I know, by the British. I'm not entirely sure why there were lots of explosives on these lorries. Perhaps they were thinking of blasting some of the rock away to create, I don't know. But anyway, apparently there was a lot of explosive in these burning lorries. So now gunners had to run down the slope and then grab ammunition out of burning lorries filled with explosives, and then, as if the fact that it's ammunition isn't bad enough, and then leg it back up the hill to feed the guns. Now, a 25-pounder shell weighs, this may not surprise you, 25 pounds. That's the actual missile that flies through the air. Then you've got the charge. And to get this over rough terrain up and down a hill must be pretty difficult. So one man probably couldn't carry more than 1 or 2 shells tops. And for hours, every shell had to be manhandled up and down this slope under heavy enemy fire, because the Germans were getting round the flanks with infantry. And it's remarkable that this, it seems, they cheerfully did. They knew that they needed ammunition. Yes, the lorries were on fire, but what do? You just got to go down there and you've got to fetch the ammunition. And so they were doing this. But you can imagine that things were, well, pretty bad. Now, the commander, Brigadier Graham, he showed up to inspect the goings-on, and this involved going down to the forward guns. There's about 800-yard path leading down to the forward guns, and that was being shelled with one German shell coming in roughly every 3 seconds. Yes, they were under that heavier fire. But anyway, he got down there and he inspected the various guns, and it seems that what he found were cheerful crews, absolutely defiant. He was particularly impressed by the number 1 crewman on each gun, and he found that the lieutenant and Sergeant Henderson, who was on the number 1 gun, which had been sighted specifically for looking down the road and taking on enemy vehicles, he found those 2 men to be not just cheerful, but an absolute inspiration to the men. He found them to be defiant and willing to carry on the fight. Now, there are lots of accounts that talk about the possibility of the British, they don't say exactly when, but this might be that time, of the British 155 battery falling back a few thousand yards to keep itself safer, and then engaging the enemy column, and they knew where it was now, from a much safer distance, and doing more damage to enemy vehicles, and possibly more of the men getting away. Perhaps they could have scuttled their guns and then scarpered. They could have kept themselves relatively safe, but the prevailing mood was that their job was to support the infantry, and the infantry was trying to delay the German advance as much as possible. Although it seems that the infantry had the impression that its main job was to support the guns. But anyway, what happened was they stayed put. They didn't fall back. And they were engaging the enemy at very short ranges. At this point, most of the engagements were happening at about 600 yards. Now, how did that happen? Was it that a decision was made not to fall back, or was it that no decision to fall back was made? I don't know. None of the accounts I've looked at record this, but anyway, we know that they didn't fall back. Did it just sort of happen? There weren't many officers there. There wasn't much time. But anyway, that was what happened. They kept to their posts. And now another German attack came at them. This time 30 tanks and self-propelled guns and lots of lorried infantry attacked the flanks using, most of the time they were out of sight and couldn't be shot at because they were using hills for cover, and they got round the sides. They were able to displace a lot of the 5th Hants, and they surrounded them, they were just 600 yards away, and cut them off from those ammunition lorries. So now there would be no more ammunition. So they have no air cover, they have German aircraft strafing them, they're running low on ammunition, they know they won't be getting any more ammunition. A very large number of the gun crews at this point are dead already. but it seems that no one was complaining. Specifically, the wounded weren't complaining. And now you might say, well, yeah, it would never make it into any of the accounts that some of them were very grumpy and complaining. That wouldn't make it into the accounts. And yes, I agree. If a couple of the wounded did complain, I think it probably would be left out of the accounts. But I can actually believe it. I've heard doctors, I've got quite a few friends who are doctors, talk about how if patients are complaining, it's actually sort of a good sign, because when they stop complaining, that's when you think, oh, they've really taken a serious turn for the worse. They're now in perhaps really serious pain, that their attitude changed. There's a time for complaining, and there are times when you're going to get serious, and maybe you have to get peace in your mind and start to accept that a certain fate is now befalling you. And if you are wounded in this sort of situation, you know you can't run anywhere, so you may as well just try to make things easy for those around you. And it's an opportunity to shine, isn't it? It's an opportunity to show that actually you can take it and can stay cheerful, or even just contemplative, just not complain, not make life difficult for those around you. And you know exactly how difficult life is right now for those around you. I can believe perhaps that it's true that the wounded really didn't complain. Now, this attack went in at about 3 o'clock. By about 3:30, the Germans looked at their situation and they thought, well, it's all over. Now, we've got them completely surrounded and cut off. They've got no more ammunition supply. A lot of their infantry support has gone. It's over. They'll probably just crumble. Maybe a lot of them have fled anyway. Perhaps they're scuttling the guns even as we speak. They're probably all ready to throw their hands up. Yeah, pretty much, job done. We can probably carry on from here. But they were wrong. They launched another attack. And I'll tell you what happened next after a word from the sponsor. Now, the sponsor is sort of relevant. Now, admittedly, the sponsor's got absolutely nothing to do with World War II or tanks or the desert. But if you, relevant person, my audience member, if you are watching this, then presumably it's relevant to you that you can hear what I'm saying. So you might be interested in a way of hearing what I'm saying. And to this end, Raycon has sent me this. In this box, it's the Everyday E25 True, oh yes, True wireless earbuds. Not false wireless earbuds. No, they've presumably got wires or something, whereas these are true. I'm not entirely sure what the true means in that context, but I'm sure that whatever it is, it's true. And after you've slit through the little circles of sticky tape, you find that something else is holding it. Yes, this plush box is held together completely unnecessarily by magnets, but it does make you think, ooh, plush box, and the feel of it, and ooh, plush box. And then you open it, and then you feel the plush blanket on the inside, and you go, ooh, it's like a velvety surface on the card. Ooh, plush box. And what's this? It's a card. It's a card envelope, and in it are some instructions, which they're a little bit simplistic, but I struggle with them a little bit. But I think you young folk, you'll understand the lingo, and you'll have no trouble at all. I've never used Bluetooth before, for instance, but do you know, even I had no trouble setting up the Bluetooth for this, which I've never used before on my laptop. There's also this small piece of paper that says "The Next Wave" on it. I have no idea why this piece of paper exists, but it does, and should you buy some of these earbuds, not earphones, earbuds, then one of these could be yours, and you could use it to, I don't know, decorate a cigar or something. So there's that. On the front, in black lettering on a black background, it says, "Welcome to the next wave," which is nice. And also in here, there's a black box. What's in the black box? Well, it's labelled, again, in black writing on a black background, and it says, "Your sound, your way." No, I'm sorry, I can't help you with that. But anyway, there's this little thumb-sized and thumb-shaped thing at the top here. And you might think you put your thumb there to open it, but no, it's a very cunning decoy. The box opens from the other side. It's clever. That's really clever. And inside you find loads of different little buds. I suppose these things maybe are the buds. Little mushroom-shaped bits of rubber that you can stick in your ear. And I have to say that hitherto I've not really got on well with things that you stick in your ear, headphones, earbuds. I think I've got very small ears, and usually just to get them to stay in there I have to apply a hammer. But I can report that actually these are far more comfortable than others I have tried, which is good. Oh yeah, and also there's an impressively short recharging cable there. And yes, and because there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different sizes, and you get 2 of each, even if you've got ears of different sizes, you should be able to find a way of fitting it to your head. And here, this is the actual thing, okay? This is really what you're paying your money for. Okay, so this is a little pod. This is called a pod. And I think this is the best thing. This is what I really like about this most, actually. It could open from that. No, it could open from this side. Okay, it's a little bit symmetrical, so there we go. So I've opened it from the right side, and it starts flashing lights at me, and a little... Connected. A little robot woman starts talking to me. Another thing I like about this is it's got magnets in it. This is good. This is good use of magnets because when I put these back, you see they go in with a very definite, satisfying ka-chung, and they don't fall out of the pod. Now the battery life on these boasts 6 hours of battery life, which is pretty good. And this is the best bit. This has also got a battery in it, and this can recharge it 3 times. So that's 6, and 3 times 6, that's 24 hours. So if you remembered to put this on to recharge at night, you could have 24, well, at least, no, who wants 24 hours? But every waking moment you could have sound in your ears, if that's what you really want. To some people that would be a form of torture, but maybe that's what you really want. Anyway, good battery life. In short, I like the pod, nicely designed, apart from that it's all black and symmetrical, so you don't know which way it opens. You don't know if you've got it upside down. Could you not have the bottom one colour and the top another one and the front a different colour so it's more obvious? But anyway, the pod is good. Now, you're probably going to ask about sound quality. If you like a really hefty rumbling bass, I can report that it's got that. They've got a hefty rumbling bass on them. Higher registers, possibly not quite as well fleshed out, but you know, these aren't the world's most expensive top-end earphones. They're going for sort of maximum bang for your buck, and they seem pretty good in that respect. So there you go. You got a little pod that slips smoothly into your pocket, and battery charges, and rumbling bass, and no wires. And why is that so important? Well, think of my juggling friend Cal, who was demonstrating here. You see, he's juggling away, but he's got wires on his headphones. And oh no, does he look happy? Does he? You want to be happier than Cal, don't you? So if you do something like juggling, you might want something like these. So that's the Raycon earbud E25. And if you go to www.buyraycon.com/Lindybeige, you can get 15% off. So that's 15% off a not particularly expensive pair of headphones. Earbuds, not headphones. The earbuds, you see. I deliberately got it wrong there, just to hammer that point home. They're earbuds. What else can I say about them? They've got a microphone in them, so you could use them for Skype and Zoom conversations and that sort of thing. Right, okay, now I think it's high time I got back to the North African desert in 1943. So it's February the 26th, and the now semi-shattered 155th battery is going to be attacked yet again by the overwhelming forces of the Germans, led again by a Tiger tank. And this time the Germans had worked 13 other tanks into good hull-down positions, and those tanks, which all still had working radios so they could talk to each other, whereas the British had lost their radios by this point, they could talk to each other and coordinate their actions to give covering fire for those tanks going forward. And at this point, they're expecting not a lot of resistance. But what they got was quite a lot of resistance. And again, Sergeant Henderson on #1 gun opens fire, and he hits the front Tiger once, twice, 3 times, knocking it out. One account said he holed it in the turret 3 times. I can't confirm that, but anyway, he knocked out the lead Tiger, probably with 3 hits. A Panzer IV tried to get round it, that got knocked out. Another tank tried to get forward, that got knocked out. Again, the Germans have had a bloody nose from these 25-pounders. Hurrah, you might think. But these 25-pounders are really not very far away, and they're firing over open sights, which means that they can see the target and the target can see them. Their positions are now very clear to those 13 hull-down and well-coordinated German tanks. Those coordinated tanks then picked a target, and they then fired at that target until that gun was silenced, and they moved on to the next. The British carried on firing. A number of accounts talk about how the gun crew of one of F Troop was singing a popular song of the time. It had been in the hit parade just the year before. It was called Praise the Lord and Pass the Ammunition. Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition and we'll all stay free. And they were singing this just when their gun was hit and they were killed. So it was a gallant, but you might say forlorn defence. The guns fell silent, and the Germans, though, had been given yet another bloody nose and again had to pause to regroup before going forward. They were not expecting that level of resistance at this stage in the fight. At 5:30 they came on again. Now there were only 3 guns of the battery still in working order at this point, and they were higher up beyond the top slope, on a slight reverse slope, which did actually give them an advantage, because as the German tanks came over the fairly steep rise, their guns were pointing skyward and they were visible to the gunners of 155 battery before they could depress their guns enough to return fire. And so they were getting hit, and there are more guns still resisting us, so some of them would then pull back. It was a very difficult thing keeping these tanks back, because most of the gunners were dead by this point, and one officer, the last sole remaining officer of 155 battery, had cobbled together his loyal batman, a few fitters and a load of cooks to man the 3 guns. But even then they still didn't have really enough men to man all 3 guns. So what they were doing is they were seeing a threat, running over to the best gun to deal with that threat, crewing that gun for a bit, seeing off a tank or 2, firing at some infantry, keeping their heads down, and then seeing another threat over there, getting up and then running over to that gun and doing what they could. They also had a couple of Bren guns as well to support, but it was a desperate defence. I can't tell you how many German tanks were knocked out at this stage, not many, but I think at least one. And again, they were able to see them off. And during the fighting at around this stage, they were able to send one signal back. They couldn't, there was nothing of military use. They didn't have any spotters that could signal them. They had no radios, but they did have one Morse line to regimental HQ. So even though they couldn't receive anything of tactical value in the fight, they could at least relay something of what was going on. And their last message was, the last full message was quite short and to the point: tanks are on us. And you could imagine that on receiving that, regimental HQ was probably thinking, okay, the end is pretty close. But it wasn't the absolute last signal they received. The last signal they received was... Now, if you understand the significance of that, you might find that quite poignant, and I would like maybe not to explain it, because I think for those who do understand, it's better not to have it explained, but I think an awful lot of you, perhaps the majority of you, don't really understand the significance of that. Dit-dit-dit-da is, think of Beethoven's Fifth. Da-da-da-dum. Dit-dit-dit-da is the Morse code for the letter V. And the British had been broadcasting to Europe dit-dit-dit-da as this symbol of defiance. They'd told populations of conquered cities all around Europe to, whenever there were some Germans in the street outside, just make some noise, just knock on a radiator, clonk, 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 or whatever. Just let the Germans in your area hear that you haven't given up the fight, that you still have defiance in you, and that one day there will be a victory. V for victory. Dit-dit-dit-da. That was the last thing that was sent over the Morse back to HQ. And the Germans, though, still had to regroup, had to make one final attack, and when the final attack went in, loads of tanks crowded onto the top of the hill, and there was just one working gun and a couple of Bren guns to resist them. And pretty soon there were so many machine gun bullets flying about the place that there was nowhere you could stand and have any hope of surviving for any length of time. So they just jumped into slit trenches, and the fate, it seems, of the last British of 155 battery was to have their bodies crushed under tanks that just rotated on the spot over those slit trenches until they were crushed into oblivion. There were 130 men of 155 battery, 9 officers and 121 other ranks. Of those, 9 made it back to their fellows. I read the account of one of them. It took him 4 days in freezing cold weather and heavy rain. He had just 1 bottle of water and 1 chocolate bar. Of those 9, some were wounded. Some accounts say 2 were wounded, some 5, some 7. I can't give you a figure, but some of them were wounded, an accurate, reliable figure, but some of them were wounded. It seems that some prisoners were taken. Again, I can't give you an accurate number. One account says 5, but I suspect that it wasn't actually known at the time how many men had been taken prisoner. When a unit like that just gets annihilated and a few stragglers run away, they wouldn't know exactly how many men were taken prisoner, but a number something like 5, one of whom, you may be glad to know, was Sergeant Henderson, who made a full recovery in a prisoner of war hospital. Some substantial while later, presumably. I think it would have taken a major wound to have taken someone like Sergeant Henderson out of the fight. So that was a unit almost, well, completely annihilated. They lost all the guns and almost all the men. They lost all of the officers and something like 95% of the men. So this was a crushing victory for the Germans and decisive defeat for the British. How many of the 5th Hants got away? Something like 200. The accounts don't really seem to concentrate on the Hants very much. Everyone concentrates on the glorious 155th. But my guess is that when they saw the game was up, they legged it, thinking that the guns would perhaps be scuttled. And I can't imagine anyone blaming them for legging it, by the way. The distances recorded for those last battles are farcically short, from 50 yards to 10 yards. The edge of the ground where the tanks were coming over was about 50 yards away, and they were also engaging the enemy at a distance of 10 yards. Now, when you're an artilleryman, you imagine that all the lethal splinters thrown everywhere by your ordnance will happen thousands of yards away and never bother you. But just think how terrifying it is to fire over open sights a 25-pounder at something that's just 10 yards away. You are in danger from your own ordnance. All the flying metal of the exploding shell on the front of that tank is going to be a threat to you. And the noise, the incredible, almost indescribable noise. Terrifying, and yet that's what it came to. I was reminded actually of this entire action, which what made me think of making this video when I recently reread the war diaries of Spic Mulugnan, the well-known typing error, who was a gunner in North Africa, who wasn't involved in this action, but he later drove past where it happened and mentioned it in the book. And he described, being a little bit poetic, saying that they fought to the muzzle, but actually 10 yards is virtually to the muzzle. I imagine if a tank really were literally at the muzzle, it would just be too dangerous to fire. You'd just kill yourself. It was a defeat. Or was it? Why did Lord Milne think it was so worth talking about? Well, the German advance, in order to be successful, had to be fast. And they had held out from 6:30 in the morning to 6:30 in the evening. They had held out for 12 hours. And the Germans had so much licking of wounds to do, so many repairs to damaged vehicles, so many units to bring back in and sort out, that night fell and they didn't get anywhere further that night. They had to advance the next day. That one day's grace was not wasted. Brigadier Graham, knowing where the German advance, knowing where the hammer was going to fall, if you like, he knew exactly where to put his guns. And he had an awful lot of gunners. He had 2 batteries of gunners who were very keen to avenge their fallen comrades. And he made absolutely sure that there were lots of eyes on that valley. He put observation posts all the way down it, and with good radios and with telephone lines, duplicate telephone lines in case one of them got cut. And he was determined to pound the hell out of that column as it came on. And it seemed for a while that God was also on the British side, because it was raining very heavily, and this created mud which slowed the Tigers down even more. Unfortunately, there was also fog, which made it very difficult for the RAF later to join in. But eventually the fog did clear and the RAF joined in. And as the days went by, the brigadier was joined by more and more forces. There were 2 batteries of 5.5-inch medium artillery joined him. Units of Churchills from the Royal Irish Horse Guards joined in. And the RAF with ground attack Hurricanes armed with 2-pounder pom-pom guns, 1 on each wing. And people often say, oh, these ground attack things weren't very effective. The rockets, for instance, launched by them were very inaccurate, those 8-inch rockets. And yeah, they were fairly inaccurate. Only about 3% of them actually hit anything useful. But these pom-pom guns were actually hitting about 25% of the time. And if you just make strafing run after strafing run on a column of vehicles, you will eventually hit a fair few targets. And that column was pounded into dust. After 10 days trying to get up this narrow pass, Hunt's Pass, Laing eventually threw in the towel and turned tail and hobbled back, having lost all but 5 of his tanks and having lost 60 other armoured vehicles and countless lorries and soft tops, as they were known. And the entire attack ground to a halt. So Operation Oxhead was a failure. And it was a failure largely because 1 battery of artillery sort of sacrificed itself, bought its comrades a day in which defeat for the Germans was made certain. So they didn't die, those men, for nothing. And years after the war, a commander of the Africa Corps talked to Brigadier Graham, saying that actually that was the day when the fight went out of the Africa Corps. That was the day when psychologically they thought, oh, okay, yeah, we have lost now. It's just a matter of time. And just 2 months later, the Africa Corps surrendered. 250,000 soldiers were taken prisoner. And that second front ended as a victory for the Allies. And I noticed as I was researching for this video that if you type in Hunt's Pass in Google Maps and zoom in, it says Hunt's Pass Tiger Graveyard. I don't know who added that, but yeah, that's what it was. It was Hunt's Pass, the Tiger Graveyard. And poor Colonel Rudolf Laing, the commander of the Germans, was given the nickname Tank Killer, which sounds quite good until you learn why he got that. And it wasn't, I'm sure, a nickname that he much relished having. So there you go. It was a sacrifice. It was sad. It was heroic, but it was worthwhile as well. And this puts me in mind of a Zoom call I had a week or 2 ago. I was talking to an old university friend of mine and a lot of his new pals of about the same age, and some of them were saying, "Oh, VE Day's coming up. Why are they bothering? It's ridiculous. Why are we commemorating that? I mean, what is that? It's almost everyone who was alive then is dead now, so it's completely pointless. And I think they should be celebrating war anyway." And I didn't say anything or anything much, but I was absolutely appalled. I mean, really appalled, because when those men of 155 Battery just thought, nah, we're going to stay here, and they were doing that even when it was pretty obvious that they were almost all going to die. No, we're going to stay here. Praise the Lord, pass the ammunition. Come on, let's see. Let's give Fritz as bloody a nose as we can give him. When they made that sacrifice, it was worth it, right? I mean, tell me it was worth it. If we remember one thing, imagine all of human memory is wiped out and there's just one thing that we can collectively commemorate, all remember. How about the thing which explains the modern world more than any other one thing? How about the biggest event that there ever was, World War II, and all the consequences thereof? If you know about World War II, you could then look at a world map and go, oh right, so that's why these countries are allied with these countries, and oh yeah, communism and the rise of the Soviet bloc, and oh Japan, oh okay, I get it, right, oh so they're allied with them now, and oh the borders there because of that, oh these people speak that language, oh because of that. And technology is the way it is because of that. Oh, we have computers. Why? But, oh, because World War II and Enigma. If you remember one thing, if we commemorate one thing, how about the biggest and most explanatory thing that has ever been? And if we celebrate, some people say we shouldn't be celebrating war. If we celebrate one thing, if you could only celebrate one thing, how about the end of the worst thing that ever happened, and express gratitude that we have all freedoms that we have. We have this wealth, this education, this freedom, this democracy. We have all these things that we enjoy now, thanks to World War II. And we have peace in Europe. Some people say, oh, nuclear weapons have kept the peace in Europe. Oh, yeah, they've played a part. And actually, it's NATO kept the peace in Western Europe. And granted, yeah, that's another factor. Or it's globalization and world trade has changed things, and now that keeps the peace in Europe. And again, yeah, absolutely, I'd agree. I wouldn't agree that the EU has done anything to keep the peace, because the EU didn't even exist until the 1990s, until after the Berlin Wall came down. So how that's supposed to have played a part, I don't know. But all these are factors. But the biggie, right? I mean, the absolute biggie, the thing that has kept peace in World War II. Why is it now? What's the main reason that it has been unthinkable since World War II for, say, Germany to go to war with France? Answer, World War II. They fought for the peace. There is peace because there was a war. And it was the biggest war there ever was. And it ended. And if we remember one thing and celebrate one thing, how about that? I'm sorry, I've gone off on a bit of a rant. This is a massive tangent at the end of this video, but I was appalled at the ignorance and downright, I just thought, staggering arrogance and ingratitude of people who could say, oh, what's the point? What's the point of VE Day? Yeah, well, I, myself, I am profoundly grateful to the men of 155 Battery, 172nd Royal Artillery. That's it.